2. Hey Jane, are you there and can you hear me? Hey there. Test 1 2. Test 1 2. Hey Jane, is it all right if we mute or pause your video? We'll want you to start your video when we get to your part in the presentation. Okay, yeah, there should be a little start video button probably in the bottom left corner that you can click and then it'll turn off. It probably says stop video actually. Great. So when we get to the point where they start introducing you, you can press your start video and you can press your unmute button, which are in the bottom left there. I'm going to go quiet now, just because my voice will be going into the room if I keep talking. So we'll see you in the show.
Welcome everybody to this afternoon's session on the future of conservation. As you will see, it's a great program, and I just want to set the stage for a minute or two. As you already have heard in the morning several times, we are moving as humankind deeper into the Anthropocene, and we are actually seeing the effects. It's like Earth is sending us messages that we are overexploiting it and that we should pay attention and get back into balance with it. In this context, of course, conservation plays an important role. How much of Earth's resources can we use, for example? What does conservation actually mean? Is it static, as it often was done in the past? Cannot be, has to be dynamic, has to follow the evolution of the planet. So with that in mind, today's session will focus on what conservation should look like in the future, so that it can contribute to our effort of finding a way into a future in which life can thrive on a healthy planet. I'd like to introduce Susan Goldberg, who joined ASU in February. Susan is Vice Dean and Professor of Practice at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. She also is a Professor of Practice in the Julian Wrigley Global Futures Laboratories College of Global Futures. Susan is based in Washington, D.C., where she will lead new programs and strategic partnerships that expands our presence in the nation's capital. You probably all know that Susan previously served as Editor-in-Chief of National Geographic and Editorial Director of National Geographic Partners. So what we will do now is, Susan, I will invite Susan to there's no podium, to the seat, and she will introduce Jane Goodall and conduct an interview of about 30 minutes with her. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. I know it is the Walton Center, but I call it the smartest building in the hottest place, right? So that's where I think we are. I'm very excited to talk to Jane, whose picture I'm sure will appear momentarily, right, on this screen. So let me introduce you. The basic narrative of Jane Goodall's life really is very well known. A young English woman conducts chimpanzee research in Africa and ends up revolutionizing primate science. Now, that's the story we're familiar with, and many of us grew up seeing Jane with her trademark blonde ponytail and khaki shorts in still photographs and in National Geographic films. But let's fill in a few more details of her biography and her work. Now, from infancy, Jane was fascinated by animal behavior, and in 1957, at the age of 23, she met paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey. 3 years later, Jane went to what is now Tanzania and, equipped only with a notebook, binoculars, and determination, ventured into the world of wild chimpanzees. The work she did in Gombe National Park, which continues to this day and is the longest running behavioral study of any free-ranging animal species, transformed the study of primates, changed our view of human nature, and inspired thousands of people, especially women, to become scientists. Now, many people know that story, but you may not know that there is a special connection between Jane, the Jane Goodall Institute, and Arizona State University. ASU's Institute for Human Origins, located right in this very building, has just become the home of the archive and database of the work that Jane started in Gombe. The archive is overseen by Associate Professor and Research Scientist Ian Gilby, and it has detailed observations of individual chimpanzees at Gombe, and it's a unique treasure for science and for history. Ian tells me that the plan is to take the archive out of the 24 giant filing cabinets in which it is now stored and to turn it into a digital resource accessible to a global audience that'll create opportunities for new discoveries and large-scale citizen science. Now, of course, Dr. Goodall's work didn't stop in Gombe. Since the late 1980s, Jane has been an advocate, speaking out on issues from the treatment of animals in captivity to human rights, the climate crisis to conservation. Her words through books, lectures, podcasts, and writings reach millions of people around the world each year, and it's a true honor to be able to speak with her today. We'll talk about the future of conservation and about being hopeful at a time when some of us don't feel quite as much hope as we should. So I'd like to introduce Jane Goodall. Oh. Well, hello, Dr. Goodall. I'm so happy and also relieved to see you up there.
Well, it's lovely to see you, Susan, too.
Well, thank you. Maybe we can up her volume just a little bit. You know, Jane, and I hope you don't mind if I call you Jane.
I hope you will.
Okay, good. Well, I know that earlier this month you celebrated your 88th birthday. And so happy birthday. And so you have seen a lot of good and bad in the world. I'd love to know, what do you see about what's going on now that worries you the most and what makes you the most hopeful?
Well, difficult questions right now, but I think what worries me most and probably is haunting many of us is Putin's war in Ukraine, because it's not only the horrendous suffering of humans and animals there, but it's also the horrific effect on the environment of all this war machinery, you know, the bombs and the tanks and the trucks and the whole paraphernalia, the exploding bombs, the threat of chemical warfare. But if we leave Ukraine aside, because that is a blip that hopefully will get solved before too many lives more are lost. But apart from that, it's a mixture of, well, it's basically the years and years during which we have disrespected Mother Nature. And as a result, that's led to the pandemic, it's led to climate change, and it's led to loss of biodiversity. And what gives me most hope is what the Jane Goodall Institute and some other organizations are doing, tying conservation in with working with the local people, the custodians of the land, the indigenous people, the people who live there, rather than segregating animals behind a fence and people on the other side, always eager because of living in poverty to break through the fence. So working with the people and improving the way that they can make a living without destroying their environment. And then as part of that is our program for young people all over the world, which is ensuring that they become better stewards when they grow up than we have been.
So Jane, I think you're talking about your program Roots and Shoots, right?
I'm talking about Roots and Shoots, right?
Roots and Shoots, which is such a great name. And I see over your right shoulder, you've got your book called, appropriately enough, Hope. So if you can look back a little bit on your career, you know, you've been able to do so many amazing things. What are the lessons that you hope that younger people can take from your journey?
I think the most important lesson is that no matter what you do, it can be a very small thing like turning off taps or lights. And it may seem unimportant to you because I mean, everybody now knows, if you look around the world, it's very, very depressing in almost all ways. But if you put millions and then hopefully billions of tiny ethical choices together, the cumulative effect moves us towards the kind of change that we need to see. And more and more young people are beginning to understand that. And then the program I mentioned around Gombe and other chimp areas in Africa, which we call Takari, that is helping the local people understand protecting the environment isn't just for wildlife, as they always used to think, it's for their own future. And as a result, these people have become our partners in conservation. So those two things, the young people understanding that even if they only do a little, if they do it every day, and hundreds and thousands and millions and billions of them do it every day, it's going to make a difference.
You know, this reminds me of a parable. There's a big forest fire and all of the animals have to flee the forest. And there's a hummingbird and a big bear and they flee the forest fire. And they're running and the bear says, thank goodness we got out of there. But he notices that the hummingbird keeps going back over and over, dropping one drop of water on the fire. And the bear says, what are you doing, hummingbird? That won't make a bit of difference. And the hummingbird says, maybe not, but I'm doing my part. And that sounds a lot like what you're saying that you'd like to see everybody doing.
That's absolutely right. Only we need millions or billions of hummingbirds to make the kind of difference I'm talking about.
So how do we, though, get people's attention? I mean, as the editor of National Geographic, I thought one of the hardest things was telling stories about climate change because you have to be journalistically accurate, and yet you don't want to be so depressing that people walk away from the content. You want to try to engage people in those stories. So what is the way that we can engage people in these stories rather than just tune them out?
Well, I think by giving examples of, when you restore a forest, that automatically helps to control the climate, helps to control rainfall, and brings biodiversity, which we're losing rapidly, back. And I think those kinds of stories which show the key thing is it's not too late, but we must get together. And I've decided it's as though humanity is at the mouth of a long, dark tunnel. And right at the end of that tunnel is a little star. That's hope. But we don't just sit at the mouth of the tunnel and hope the star will come to us. No, we have to roll up our sleeves and start crawling under, climbing over, working around all the obstacles that lie between us and that star. And that includes climate change, loss of biodiversity, poverty, because the very poor will destroy the environment to survive, unsustainable lifestyles. We could go on and on listing the problems we face. But if we go through that tunnel and we reach out and gather others with us, and we all work to overcome the obstacles, and there's enough of us to be interested in each different aspect of the problem, then we have hope.
You know, I think we've all, in the last 2 years going through the pandemic, have really seen some of the impact of the problems that we have wrought. And I was interested in a comment you made recently where you said, we've penetrated deep into animals' habitat, giving viruses the opportunity to jump from animals to human. We're also crowding animals together in wildlife markets, trafficking them around the world and creating additional opportunities for new diseases to emerge. So how do we change that?
Well, we learn to respect animals. It's been a long, slow process, you would say, but same thing. And, when I went to Cambridge, Louis Leakey sent me to Cambridge when I'd been with the chimpanzees about 1.5 years. I had not been to college at all, but he got me a place in Cambridge University to do a PhD in ethology. I didn't even know what ethology was. I wanted to be a naturalist and write books about animals. That was it. Anyway, I get to Cambridge I'm horrified to be told I've done everything wrong, that I shouldn't be giving chimpanzees names. Numbers were more scientific. I couldn't talk about their personality, mind, emotion. Those were unique to us. Well, anybody who's spent time with dogs or cats or horses or rabbits or guinea pigs or parrots, or I don't care what, know that that's wrong. And because of my dog Rusty, who was my companion through childhood, I was able to, no, I didn't confront the professors. I just went on quietly talking about the chimps the way I knew they were. And so gradually science emerged from this reductionist way of thinking and came to the conclusion that after all, we are part of and not separate from the rest of the animal kingdom. But you may not believe, Susan, that way back in 1962, we were actually told that the difference between us and all other animals was one of kind. In other words, a sharp line. We were unique. We were separate. We could do what we liked with the rest of the world. It was our oyster. And gradually that has been changing, but we've still got a long way to go. And it's the way we've treated the animals that's led to this pandemic, which has caused economic chaos around the world. And fortunately, using that as a sort of jumping off point, you can talk to people about the need to respect animals.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned your observations about the animals that you made in these notebooks, many of which are here at Arizona State University. Tell me, what's going to happen to this rich database? What would you like to see come of this archive, your archive of your work?
Well, I think when it's all digitized, you know, I'm really thrilled that Ian Gilby is there to sort of oversee it, because he worked for ages at Gombe. So, you know, he's one of us. And so I hope that the data will be placed in such a format that students from around the world can use it. And it needs to be used. I mean, the data is so precious. And one of the most precious things about it is the long-term nature. You know, chimps can live to be up to 60 years. They're all different. They have vivid personalities. We can finally determine who the fathers are through DNA analysis by collecting fecal samples, because they're very promiscuous. So we only used to guess who was the father of which child. But being able to trace behavior through the different generations, finding that new behaviors are still arising. You know, this gives you some idea of the complexity of animal societies.
So when you look back on that research, what are the big mysteries that we still want to discover about chimpanzees or other animals in the wild? What are the things that we have really yet to learn that you think we need to find out?
Well, first of all, in general, I tell students today, it's the most exciting time in my lifetime to study animal behavior, because science has opened up. We can study animal personality, animal emotions. The study of animal intelligence is just exploding. We're finding out, you know, the enormous intelligence of the octopus and the lobster, and the fact that you can train bumblebees to drop little pebbles into holes and get rewarded with a nectar sip, and other bumblebees who haven't been trained can learn just by watching. So, I mean, we're finding out all these things. I'm waiting for the day when we no longer say, how amazing, but, oh, well, yes, why not? Because we've been so arrogant. But, you know, specific problems with the chimpanzees, we have, I think there's about 8 study sites across Africa now, so we can learn more about chimpanzee culture. And here it's so important to conserve the small groups. There's been this big push to go to the biological hotspots, you know, where the most animals are. Those are the ones to save. But if you're interested in cultural differences, it's the outliers, the ones who are pushed to extreme levels of climate, for example, as in Senegal and Mali. That's absolutely fascinating to see how adaptable they can be. And, you know, there's just so much still to discover just about the Gombe chimps, let alone all the rest.
I'd love if you could think back when you went to Gombe in 1960. So you were a young woman, basically by yourself. I know your mother was sent to go with you, and you have thanked her for that many times. But what was that like being a woman in science then compared to now? And obviously there's been a lot of progress, but has there been enough progress?
Well, you know, my career path was so different from that taken by other women scientists, because I wasn't going into a male-dominated world, because there weren't men out there studying in the field. George Shallow with the gorillas, a couple of Americans with Chacma baboons in South Africa. But, you know, it wasn't a field that was, as it is today, filled with eager students from all over the world, in all parts of the world. It was brand new. Nobody had even tried to study chimps before. And I was really lucky in that Louis Leakey chose me partly because I hadn't been to college, so I wouldn't have a reductionist view of animal behavior drummed into my head, and partly because I was a woman, and he felt that maybe women were more patient in the field. And if you think of our role through evolution, what was our role? Our role was to be good mothers and good wives looking after the family. And if you're not patient, you can't really be a good mother. If you've had small children, you know that that's a fact. And it also turns out that women are much quicker at interpreting little signals that go on between family members. So if Uncle Joe is in a bad mood, then keep your precious 2-year-old away from him, that sort of thing. So maybe Louis was right, I don't know, but I didn't meet those same kind of barriers. And the barriers that I faced when I got to Cambridge, I don't think that those were especially because I was a woman. Since I began, of course, there's been huge change in the role of women in all sorts of different positions and disciplines and jobs. Of course, we haven't gone far enough, especially in some countries, but the change has been, in my lifetime, huge.
When do you think, was there a moment when you went from primarily a scientist to an activist? Or do you consider yourself an activist, actually? I should ask you that first.
Yeah, I think I'm an activist. And it all happened at this conference that I helped put together in Chicago in 1986. And we brought together the different scientists. By then there were about 6 study sites, including the Japanese scientists, who are a bit of a mystery. You know, they'd done the only other long-term study of primates with the Japanese monkeys. And of course, they're the only, quote, civilized country to have wild primates. And they came for the first time over to America to join in a conference with translators. And we had this conference, which was mainly, does chimp behavior differ from one environment to another? Does it stay the same? Is there something like culture, which I was maintaining, but of course the scientific community was pushing that aside as, you know, by then, yes, I was a female, but anyway. And so at that conference, we also had a session on conservation and one on conditions in some captive situations. And right across Africa, where chimps were being studied, pictures of devastated forests, chimpanzees caught in wire snares, losing hands or feet, chimpanzees for sale in the markets, their mothers shot. And then I was haunted for days and days by our closest living relatives in five foot by 5 foot, measure it out, it's so small, laboratory cages in medical research labs, these social beings isolated. And there was no mention of anything like enrichment back then. They were just in these bare metal cages with bars all around. And I couldn't sleep, and it was just so awful. So those two things turned me into an activist.
What do you still want to do?
What do I still want to do?
What do you know, obviously you're full of energy and ideas, and what do you, when you lie in bed at night, what do you think, I got to get this done tomorrow? What do you want to do?
Well, it's not so much tomorrow, except I've got to do 3 Zoom calls and 2 interviews tomorrow. And I've got to do. Because during the pandemic, I have never, ever, ever been so busy in my whole life. But leaving that aside, and this, by the way, I'm in LA now. It's my first trip out of the UK since the pandemic began. So I'm back on the road, so to speak. But, you know, what I feel is really, really important is the Roots and Shoots program, because this is the future. And it's just so important to help young people to understand that within their hands lies the power to make change. And it's not only the things that they actually can do, like recycling and stuff, but they educate their parents. And sometimes their parents are, you know, important decision makers. So I was talking to the CEO of a big corporation, international corporation, about 3 weeks ago. And he said, Jane, for the last 8 years, I've really been working to make my company ethical for my customers, for the central office, along the supply chain, in the country where we get our products from, in their communities. Why? 3 reasons. 1, seeing the writing on the wall that we're using up Mother Nature's natural resources faster than nature can replenish them in many places. 2, consumer pressure. People are beginning to understand they don't want a product that was made harming the environment or cruel to animals like the factory farms, which also devastate the environment, by the way. They don't want a product that's cheap because of unfair wages. And so companies are beginning to change. But, said this man, the thing that really tipped the balance for me was my little girl. She was 8 or 10 years old. And she came back from school one day and she said, Daddy, they're telling me that what you're doing is hurting the planet. That isn't true, is it, Daddy? Because it's my planet.
Well, Jane Goodall, that is a story that I'm going to think about for a very long time. It has been such an inspiration to talk with you, such an honor to see you, and thank you so much for all you've done and for joining us today at Arizona State University. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Peter Schlosser for the next part of our program. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. What a great session, what an inspiration. We're now moving to the next part of this afternoon session, and it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Peter Seligmann. Peter is the co-founder and CEO of Neotero, as well as the co-founder of Conservation International, where he also currently is the chair of the board. Neotero, started in 2017, works with indigenous peoples to ensure they have the economic power and cultural independence to steward, support, and protect their livelihoods and lands. Peter has been a visionary and thought leader in conservation for nearly 40 years. In 1987, he co-founded Conservation International to protect nature for the benefit of people. But during the past few decades, the nonprofit has become so much more, increasing its work to focus on biodiversity and human well-being, as well as conservation, research, and finance. Conservation International partners with communities, indigenous peoples, governments, and businesses, much like the Julian Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory, which is also a partner of Conservation International, so the circle closes. Peter holds a Master of Science in Forestry and Environmental Science from Yale University, and a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Ecology from Rutgers University. He has honorary doctorates in science from Michigan State University and Rutgers University. Please welcome Peter to the podium.
Well, first, thank you so much, Peter, for the invitation to be here and to see all the people that are putting their lives into this challenge of sustainability in this extraordinary building, which is what we need. It's the creativity, the open-heartedness, the collaboration, the willingness to kind of knock down the walls and the barriers and to bring people together. So thank you for the opportunity. And I could not be at ASU without thanking Michael Crow for just being Michael Crow. I'm fortunate. I'm very, I'm so fortunate to be able to work with him on a regular basis, not just, with things related to ASU, but also, in efforts relating to indigenous peoples around the world. He is well, it's not what he is. It's you are just lucky. That's all I can say. You're really, really lucky. And since I'm here for the inauguration of this extraordinary building focusing on planetary health, I would just want to give a special thanks to two of my closest friends, to Rob Walton and to Melanie Walton, for just being who they are. And they're very, very different from each other. Rob is the strong silent type. He kind of sees the world from above. He's a pilot, and has always loved looking at the landscape. I mean, he sees where the mountains are and where the rivers flow and where the soils get deposited, where the desert begins, and he's been fascinated with that. I mean, he has a deep, deep passion for how this planet operates, and he's had an impact that is extraordinary, truly extraordinary. Goes way beyond this building. It's truly extraordinary. And where Rob looks at the planet Earth, Melanie looks at the universe. It is so fascinating. And Michael and I have had many conversations with two of them where we listened to Melanie talking about the interconnectedness of energy, the interconnectedness of atomic material, the fact that the stars and the bumblebee are made from the same stuff, and that it all depends upon energy and it has no boundaries. And I've had her explain that to me a dozen times. I'm beginning to understand it a tiny bit, but it's a yin and a yang. And I just want to just start out by acknowledging that from Rob and Melanie for what they have helped you to create. I've also had the joy and the pleasure of traveling with Rob and with Melanie all over the world. And we've been diving in some of the deepest places. We've climbed up the Volksberg in Suriname. We've had poisonous snakes drop on us. We've been charged by rhinos and escaped alive. They might look urbane and civilized right here. I've seen them filthy, and I've seen them in rough spots, and we've had such an extraordinary time learning and exploring together. So to you too, thank you for what you've done for so many. It goes way beyond this, as I say. It's helping African parks, it's helping Conservation International. It's thinking about big issues like how do you stop climate change, and it's transforming Walmart so that that company has become a global agent of change, ensuring that if a supplier wants to have something on the shelf in Walmart, they've got to do it in a sustainable way. It's redesigning the trucks. It's looking at how you manage waste. It's actually had an impact that goes beyond what any institution can do on its own. And I just want to mention that because that's a big leverage. It's the same type of leverage that we get at Arizona State University. It's the idea that universities that are going to be great cannot think about how they're exclusive, but have to think about how do you knock down the barriers for people to get in and to learn. That's a totally different approach. And it's the approach that we all have to be thinking about. It's the approach that we need to embrace and support, because more than at any other time in history, we need that open-mindedness, open-heartedness, and opportunity to learn and think of new ideas together. Because as all of you know, we are in a planetary crisis. Jane talked about it. And just as an aside about Jane Goodall, my very first day in graduate school, which was in 1972, Jane Goodall was giving a guest lecture at Yale University, talking about her relationship with the chimps and what she was learning from them. She has been an icon and a leader for decades, and she continues to go strong. So we have a crisis, a global crisis, and all of us know about it. We experience it. We're experiencing droughts and floods, and we're experiencing shifts in ecological systems caused by extinction. We're seeing an overuse, a overuse and a destruction of ecological systems all over the planet Earth. Extinctions at a scale that we have never seen or experienced or imagined before. And our systems are collapsing. So there's no hiding or avoiding the fact that from an ecological perspective, we are like a bull in a china shop, and we are shattering the china. And plus, an unintended consequence of the way we have lifted communities up through making energy available and expensive has been a shifting of the CO2 balance. We've taken CO2 out of the ground and popped it into the atmosphere, and we are not in a place where we are going to get out of this problem without a major shift. We are in the age of adaptation right now. The concept of avoiding 1.5 degree rise in temperature, it will never happen. We're going to go beyond that. We're going to go beyond 2 degrees. We are in a place where we're going to have to think about resilience. We're going to have to think about how do we adapt to the changes. We're seeing the changes all over the place. I mean, we're seeing changes right now in the Amazon. With the Amazon forest, if you've been reading in the New York Times, the Amazon forest is actually to a place where we're very close to where a shift in precipitation could just go across the entire Amazon, with the Amazon becoming a savanna. I mean, it's a very real possibility. The Arctic, the ice shelves, Antarctic melting, currents shifting. We're in a place that we've never been before. And so, that's real. And so, I think that part of what this building represents is the opportunity to bring creative minds together to get to the adjacent possible. We need to get to what's possible to where we are. It's adjacent to where we are. And this is not incremental. This is from a book called Where Great Ideas Come From by Stephen Johnson, The Adjacent Possible. And that takes all of us. It takes an open-heartedness, a mindfulness, a willingness to explore, challenging conventional wisdoms, accepting that we are making mistakes by the way we perceive the earth. And I'll touch upon that for 1 second. We see this earth as a commodity. We value it. What is the present value of this acre, that lot, that forest, that iceberg, that fishery? And it's always done in economic terms. It's the worst way to be thinking about this planet, because this is a living place. It is not a commodity. And until we get out of that mindset, we're going to continue to go down the path that we're in. So I was very fortunate as a child. I spent much of my childhood in Wyoming. I studied grizzly bears. I just had the most extraordinary opportunities to learn, to be exposed to nature. And I remember so crystal clearly the first day I was changing a dam and an irrigation ditch on a ranch in Wyoming when I was 13 years old. So when you irrigate, you put a dam on a channel and the water hits the dam and it floods and it flows to the next channel. And then you put another dam there and then it floods. And so when you're a 13-year-old kid, it's a great job because you put the dam in, you get wet, it's kind of muddy, you lie down, you chew on a piece of grass and you wait until the water flows to the next dam. It is the easiest job in the world. And I did that many years. But I always remember when I was 13 years old, lying on the ground, chewing on a sweet piece of grass, waiting for the water to flow. And I looked at a bumblebee. And I just remember distinctly thinking to myself, that bumblebee is a being. It's as much a being as I am. And I didn't think about that for years. But over the course of many years, I spent my life working on conservation, first actually at the Nature Conservancy, where I was a land manager, then at Conservation International, an organization that I started with friends in 1987. And we focus on how do you protect the planet Earth. And we started out focusing on biological diversity. Where are those places that have the greatest concentrations of species? We call them biodiversity hotspots, and they were 30 places. They covered 15% of the Earth's surface. They had something like 60 or 70% of the species. And we wanted to just do, what are the deals that can be done to protect those? You know, what do you buy? You know, how do you kind of create an agreement that that place will be secure? And it was probably after 15 years of doing that, that I added up the amount of acreage that we had been successful with partners in protecting. And it was a lot. It was hundreds of millions of acres. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. And then I calculated, well, if you wrap that around the Earth, that millions of acres, how much of the Earth will it cover? It covered like a line that was about that wide on a globe. It was nothing compared to what had to happen. And I realized that the work that we were doing, focusing on protecting this hot spot and that spot, was important, but we were surrounded by a sea of development. We are surrounded by societies that did not value nature, understand nature, or appreciate that we humanity depended upon all other beings. And that was when we changed our mission. That's when we began to think, who are the global agents of change? Which are the entities that you have to engage with? Which are the doors that have to be opened up? Who are the people that can make a difference? And how do we get them involved in the design of the solutions so that they own those solutions? And that's when we first looked at the Gates Foundation. And I had conversations with Bill Gates saying, you got to protect biodiversity. And his response is, we don't really have to do that. With technology, we can replace species. And it's when I began to try to find who were the partners that would step up. And eventually, with the Gates Foundation, we were able to explain that all of those smallholder farmers in Africa that were that the Gates Foundation was focusing on, every one of them, 5 acres or 10 acres of land, that if they had good seeds and they could get to the marketplace and they had the right technology, that was really important. But those farms depended upon where did they get their water from, where did they get their pollinators from, where did they get their soil organisms from. That is ecological systems. And luckily, the right people showed up at the Gates Foundation. We had conversations and they accepted that this had to be part of their bigger investment. And the reason it was so important, it was at that time the biggest foundation in the world. We had to begin to think about global agents of change. And I've already mentioned, that was part of the strategy with Walmart. It was, how can a big company with a big footprint actually become an agent of change? And so over the years in this work in conservation, I was really fortunate enough to see so much of this planet, to work with such extraordinary human beings with so many partners and to feel satisfied that that we had actually done some good work with billions of acres of the earth. But then, as with all of us, life moves on. And in 2015, I had a conversation with our board of directors and said, I'm going to step down from CI. And at that point, we were right in the midst of conversations about climate change. And it was obvious to all of us that climate change required a portfolio of solutions. It wasn't just one solution. Most folks were focusing on renewable energy, because renewable energy, get rid of the bad fossil fuels, put in renewable energy. And obviously that's a smart thing to do, but it's not nearly enough. And so we began to have conversations about what is the role that the natural world plays in addressing climate. And as some of you will know, but some of you might not know, forests, mangroves, seagrasses, ocean organisms, terrestrial organisms are carbon sinks. They can absorb, take carbon out of the atmosphere, much of it through photosynthesis. And so we calculated that a third of the climate solution rested in nature, in the activity that natural systems function and how they take carbon out and capture and sequester it. And so we began to focus at Conservation International, but many organizations were thinking about this. We began to focus on what are the nature-based solutions. And as I was leaving CI, I asked our scientists, okay, we know a third of the earth, a third of the climate challenge can be addressed by nature, but where? Where on earth are these places? Map them so we can see where we should focus. And so the science team came up with a map, and they said, these big swaths of the Congo and the island of New Guinea and the Amazon and the boreal forests of Canada and the islands in the South Pacific. And so we identified where were these big important places for capturing carbon. And then I asked, who owns those? And what I learned then is really important. And this is really the heart of what I want to touch upon. What I learned was that 40% of this planet Earth is under the guardianship, the active guardianship of indigenous peoples. 80% of the biodiversity, half of all the forests, 40% of the intact ecosystems, indigenous peoples taking care of this place. And what we need to realize, and we heard about it a little earlier this morning from Haunani, what we need to realize is that in 1493, the year after Columbus discovered America, right? The year after the Great Discovery, the Pope issued a papal bull. And the papal bull said, European princes, the commandment thou shalt not kill only applies to Christians. Go out and take what you can get. If they won't convert, you can kill them or enslave them. And we're going to split the proceeds 50-50. And that began the age of colonization. And for 500 years, that's what's taken place. It's active today. It's not as if it stopped. But think about this again. If 40% of the earth is under the guardianship of indigenous peoples, and if about a third of the above ground carbon is on their territories, these are the peoples that we need to be focusing on supporting. These are the peoples that have not only the territory, but they have the wisdom. These territories are still healthy because of the innate, committed, culturally shaped belief systems. And what's really interesting is that if you talk to the Dene people of the boreal forests of the Northwest Territories of Canada, if you speak to the Inuit people, if you speak with the Dene, if you speak with the Maori, if you meet with the Marubo or the Maasai, they all share a common belief system, which is called reciprocity. That they, as beings, have a reciprocal relationship with all the other beings that they share their place with. We are the outlier. We are the only ones that make it a commodity. I was in Greenland a couple of years ago, and I was with the premier of Greenland, an Inuit man, and President Trump had just said, we want to buy Greenland. And I'm sure you remember that. And I was with the premier at the time, and I said, so what do you think about this? And he said, I thought he was joking. How do you ask us to sell our sister, our mother, our place, our brother? That's our relationship with this place. And I think that for us, that's what we need to remember. That's what we have to understand. That if we give support to indigenous peoples in self-governance and the capacity to secure their culture, and if we learn to listen through storytelling, through sharing of messages, if we learn to listen to how they look at the earth, if we listen to their story, we will learn a lot. I was also up in a place called Great Bear Lake, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Everything's distorted by COVID, so I used to go to these places regularly. And in Great Bear Lake, or the Satu region, Satu means bear. Great Bear Lake is 60 miles below the Arctic Circle. It's a lake that's 300 miles across. It's a territory of the Dene people, where you could fit all Western Europe into their territory. Their mythology is that they are committed to keeping their lake clean because the people of the South are going to need clean water. That's their culture, that's their belief system. And when I was traveling with some elders and we were hunting caribou and fishing so we could bring food back to the community for the other elders, I said to them one night, there's so many bear around here. Can you tell me stories about bear? And they just shook their head and wagged their finger and said, we don't tell story about bear, and bear don't tell story about us. And that's how we get along. It's just the relationship and the acknowledgement. So in 2017, after I had a wonderful one-day retirement from Conservation International, we created a new organization called Neotero. And Neotero means our earth in the language Esperanto. Esperanto was started in the 1890s by a German banker and a Polish ophthalmologist, and it was going to be the language of Europe, a common language that would ensure that there would be peace and understanding across Europe. Of course, that has not been successful. But the language was a great idea, and when we were coming up with a name, no one was using Esperanto, so we could do whatever we wanted. So we came up with Neotero, our earth. And so Neotero's purpose is to be an ally to indigenous peoples. And Neotero's structure is we have 13 board members, 7 of them are indigenous. The chair is indigenous. There's a Waorani woman from the Ecuadorian Amazon. There's a Kakana woman who's our chair from the Cordillera of the Philippines. There's a Kanaka man from Hawaii. There's an extraordinary gathering. There's a Maori who is one of the 5 Supreme Court justices in New Zealand. There's a Supreme Court justice of the Cherokee Nation. Extraordinarily wise, brilliant people. We want to build an organization that could bridge and earn trust between indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples. Our staff is the same. And the purpose is simply to support indigenous peoples in taking care of their place. They know how to do it. They need support so they're not under assault. When you go to a place like Brazil, when you go to the Amazon, which is largely under the guardianship of indigenous peoples, you're running into a guy named Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, who says that what he is really good at is killing people. That's what he brags about. And territories of indigenous peoples are under assault there. So to give you a sense of what Neotero does, we help people that are indigenous protect their territory. There's a valley there called the Vale do Javari. It's the size of Portugal. There are no roads. There are no airports. There's no access other than by boat. There are 15 tribes in the Vale do Javari that have never had contact with the outside world. And today, it's miners, it's loggers, and it's the fishing industry accessing, encouraged by the government of Brazil and the President Bolsonaro saying, it's against the law, but we are not going to watch. We'll look the other way. So what we've done is finance the Supreme Court. What we have done is finance a legal department for an indigenous organization, and they have filed a brief with the Supreme Court suing the government of Bolsonaro for breaking the law, breaking the Constitution. And for the first time, an indigenous organization with indigenous lawyers was successful in a Supreme Court battle in Brazil for the first time. So these are communities that are extraordinarily wise. They have the right relationship with their place. They have the deepest regard for all species. They understand how that place can thrive. And they have so much that we can listen and hear and learn. So there's another effort that I want to touch upon. It's called 30 by 30. And there's a really big push right now by many governments to protect 30% of the earth by 2030. And the United Nations is pushing this effort. There are many organizations involved. Unfortunately, there is great resistance to this. And the resistance comes from communities, nations, states that are saying, we'll protect the earth, but you got to pay us. In fact, for us to sign up, we need $100 billion a year. It's never going to happen, not quickly enough. But if you go back to what I told you earlier about indigenous peoples control 40% of the earth right now. They are prepared with their support to step up. They can do this without governments. So there are opportunities that we need to be leaning into. There are things that we need to be doing. And I would just say to all of you that I actually feel really hopeful. And the reason I'm so hopeful is that when I began this journey many decades ago, there wasn't a single corporation, there are no schools, there are no small businesses, there are no governments that were thinking about these issues. They were in total denial. That has changed. Every good school, every responsible business, and most nation states now see that they cannot avoid dealing with these issues. And so there is an enormous change from decades ago. It's exciting. When I was in Glasgow a couple of months ago for the negotiations, it was the young people in the streets that made shit happen. They were loud. They would not stop being heard. It was the indigenous peoples that were there saying, we want our time now. And the voices are loud. And what happens when you have that much power with your vote, and that much power with what you buy, and that much power about deciding who you're going to work for, you have influence and impact. And that's the shift that's taken place. And it's happening across this entire planet. So we might be behind the 8 ball. We might be a little slow in getting to where we need to be, but the train is accelerating. And it's places like this that have the opportunity to bring great minds together, to challenge each other with civil arguments, with open-heartedness, with negotiation about, what's the pathway we should take? How do we listen to other cultures? That's what gives me the hope. And I would close by saying, when I look at the portfolio of engagements, whether it's technology or whether it's how we invest our resources and what organizations we support, where we put our money, I think that those are 2 essential parts of a solution. But I truly believe that the most significant thing we can do is reflect upon our own core values. And our core values have got to shift. They've got to go from looking at this earth and other beings as commodities into recognizing that we have a reciprocal obligation. We take care of them, they will take care of us. And if we do not get to reciprocity, we're going to continue to make short-term decisions about what's good for my pocket right now, instead of thinking that we have an obligation as beings to look at this earth as a partner and a family member, as a relation. We take care of our relations. That's the shift that's required. And that's what all of us should be pushing for. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Wow. Very, very inspiring stuff. It's a real honor to be here. My name is Keith Ladzinski. And tonight I wanted to, well, I should say this afternoon. Sorry, usually these things are at night for me. I wanted to talk about two stories I worked on under National Geographic, actually under the leadership of Susan Goldberg here, who you are very lucky to have and will be missed at National Geographic. I want to open up tonight or this afternoon. Is this working? Sorry, one second. By taking us from North America down to the Antarctica Peninsula. And the Antarctica Peninsula is an extraordinary place, but it's not exactly easy to access. It's the small 70-foot fishing boat we were on to cross the Great Passage, the Drake Passage. And it's a very turbulent ride, as you can see. You can also fly in if you're lucky, but we chose to go this way. And you can see that it's like the rinse cycle. You know, you're basically getting sloshed around for the better part of 6 days for us, because we did not steam very quickly based on the size of the boat. I can also tell you that on arrival, you get off the boat like a drunken sailor. You truly don't know where your equilibrium is completely off, your footing is completely skewed. But sorry, I keep pushing this. Is it forward or backward? There we go. I guess it's that way. When you access the fjords themselves, the water can be quite placid, and you're surrounded by these amazing mountains covered in glaciers. And it's truly an Antarctic safari. You're standing amongst thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of different animals, like this colony of penguins here. And the story we were working on was really about this little crustacean here. This is a krill. Krill is one of the most important little food sources in the entire ocean. In fact, there's 85 species of krill globally. In Antarctica right now, because the waters are so rich with krill, these krill are being fished out of these waters at a pretty heavy rate. About 225 million krill or pounds of krill are pulled out of the oceans every year. And why that's such a problem is because krill is the staple of, sorry, I'm a little bit ahead of myself. The thing about krill is they feed off of phytoplankton, but they also feed off of algae that grows underneath glaciers and sea ice. And Antarctica is losing sea ice at a very rapid rate. So krill's kind of in a vice because you have this heavy fishing that's happening there, but you also have these animals that need this krill, and you also have ice being lost. So their food source is being taken right out from under their feet. And right here you have, down in Antarctica, there's 5 species of penguin, 6 species of seals, 8 species of whale, and 17 species of birds. Now, all of these animals are completely codependent on krill as their primary food source, minus some other things like leopard seals will occasionally eat penguins if they can, but krill primarily is what they need to survive. This is a krill fishing boat right here. This is a Japanese sea vessel. And how this operation works is they send out these big, gigantic nets. They find these krill bait balls and they suck them in and they pull them on board on these ships, and then they store them down below into these freezer areas. Now, right now, the krill fishing it's basically really complicated in Antarctica because you have 11 different countries sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here, forgive me. There's oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. Forgive me. I'm gonna start over from the top here. These boats store the krill underneath the ships here, and they take them back to their corresponding countries. Sorry, I cannot believe I'm bombing like this up here. I'm so sorry. I came out with such a hot start. This has quite literally never happened. I know what my train of thought is. I am so sorry. So what we're primarily using krill for is things we can get from other places. We're using krill for aquaculture and pet food, and also for omega-3s, which you can find in omega-3 supplements that are used for your health. But the thing with omega-3s is we don't need to be grabbing them from krill. You can get krill, or you can get omega-3s from natural vegetables like this: walnuts, berries, hemp seed, a variety of different food sources. And what we're doing down in Antarctica is we're pulling the lifeline right out from under all of the marine life that lives down there. And sorry, I cannot believe this is happening. I need to collect my thoughts for just 1 second. While you walk around Antarctica, this is a very common scene to see whale bones. These are more or less relics from about 100 years ago, during the whaling years, when whale ships were coming down and extracting whales out of the water at a very, very rapid rate. Actually brought many of the whales to the brink of extinction. Blue whales have never recovered. Some of the other whales actually have. But when you're walking around, you see this haunting scene of just penguins living amongst skeletal structures of old whale bones, and these resources were extracted at a very rapid rate. We just heard that we use nature as, we look at it as a commodity. And that is exactly what's happening right now with what we're doing to krill. We've used whales as a commodity during those years, and then fur seals as well. During, I think it was 1907 to 1923, about 1.2 million fur seals were killed, all for the fur trade. And it took about 100 years for those numbers to come back and get very stable again. And thankfully, fur trade has ended. But truth be told, when we go down to these areas and we extract resources at this level, we're doing a great injustice to the environment. First, sorry, I cannot believe. I'm just going to move right on to the Great Lakes. I sincerely apologize. Thank you. I had just talked about all this recently. Thank you. Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you. I just want to back up. Okay. So, oh my goodness. No, I take that back. I'm going to go straight into Great Lakes. I'm so sorry. So the Great Lakes in North America is an incredible place. It's 20% of the world's natural fresh water. It's a place that's home to 54 million jobs. It's a $6 trillion economy. So a $6 trillion GDP in just the Great Lakes Basin alone. So if you were to silo that, you can tell that this is a very, very important piece of the planet. It all starts with this. I have to address this first. This is the Great American Loop. Oh my God, I am so deeply embarrassed right now. I'm quite sorry, everybody. Yeah, thanks. I am unhappy with my performance. I want to go back to these bullet points really quick. So one of the great things about the Great Lakes is its natural resource, right? It's 20% of the world's water. And it's a home to a multitude of jobs. It's again, it's a large Christ, Keith. No, I appreciate this. I cannot believe I'm doing this right now. Okay. Thank you. Let me give this one more try. Okay, thank you. Jeez. So, no, thank you, Susan. My gosh, I had this thing so rehearsed. Okay, so I want to walk us through what makes the Great Lakes such a special part of North America. And it's really part of the building blocks of the economy of North America looking back. So the Great Lakes have a trade route called the Great American Loop. So what the Great American Loop is if you were to jump on a boat in Miami, you could sail up the East Coast, you could drop into the St. Lawrence River, circumnavigate the entire Great Lakes, come all the way around, drop into the Mississippi River, come back down to the Gulf of Mexico, back to where you started. So this trade route right here is extraordinary. because there's no cheaper way to move goods and services around than by cargo, by ship cargo, especially mass cargo. So because of this, you had massive industry that is sort of like colonized all around this area. This is a pretty typical scene. This is down in southern Chicago, looking at Gary, Indiana. What you can see here is massive neighborhoods surrounding big factories like steel factories and cement factories, pharmaceutical factories, British Petroleum. Because what they can do is they can create cargo or create goods and services here, put them on ships and send them down and access any ocean from the Atlantic Ocean up the St. Lawrence or down through the Gulf, distributing things outward. This is the Ambassador Bridge that connects Windsor, Canada into Detroit. 7,000 trucks cross this bridge daily. It's about $140 billion worth of cargo is transported across this bridge annually. In the background, you can see Zug Island, which has been more or less decommissioned. This is a big, heavy industrial area. The city of Detroit at one time was one of the most opulent cities in the world, and it was because here in this area, you can not only create a lot of great goods, but you could ship them out quite effectively and quickly. This all started back in the 1900s during the fur trade and the timber trade, when the loop was actually created. I'm going to go back to this. The Great Lakes isn't exactly an easy place to navigate by boat. And back in the timber and the fur trade, many ships would get run aground on reefs and different things like that when storms would come in. And today, if you were to dive underwater and look at those boats, you'll see this. You'll see boats that are full of quagga and zebra mussels, snails. One quagga or zebra mussel can filter 1 liter of water per day. And there's an estimated 10 trillion snails that are stuck to that are living in the Great Lakes today. So you can imagine 10 trillion gallons of water or liters of water are filtered daily. And the problem is that it's sucking all the nutrients out of the water. So the Great Lakes historically are actually, the visibility isn't really like that great there because it's so rich with nutrients. Well, all those nutrients in the water are sustaining that marine ecosystem. So these quagga and zebra mussels are actually one of the biggest problems that the Great Lakes are facing as far as an ecosystem is concerned. Invasive species are a massive problem. They've all come over on cargo ships. These are invasive Asiatic carp. The carp actually haven't made it into the lakes yet, but on the fringe of the lakes, all the tributary waters that come in through the Mississippi and through the Tennessee and all the different river systems around there, they've taken great precaution to keep these fish from coming in, because once they do, they're going to completely offset and unbalance the ecosystem. These fish here, they spend about $200 million a year just on the effort of keeping these fish from entering into the Great Lakes. If they were to get in there, they would wreak even more havoc than these quagga and zebra mussels are actually doing. This is a lamprey. Lampreys also came over on cargo ships back in the early 1900s, along with all the other, there's about 189 invasive species in the Great Lakes total. This was one of the most demonstrative ones to ever make it over into the lakes. These big parasitical eels, what they do is they actually latch onto the side of fish, and it's a pretty grisly death. They eat these fish alive. And the lamprey actually took out about 90% of freshwater stock fish that were all in the Great Lakes area. 90%. And by the late 1960s, they finally figured out a solution through great research and a tremendous amount of money, where they could basically find the spawning grounds of these different lampreys, and they have this poison that they stick into these little spawning grounds, which has brought the numbers down dramatically. But prior to that happening, 90% of freshwater fish were killed out of the Great Lakes. So 90% were killed from this one particular animal here. But this is one of the few success stories, right? Most of these invasive animals in there right now, there's no solution for zebra and quagga mussels. One of the great economic powers around the Great Lakes, as well as the agriculture practice. This is actually a Welch's vineyard. And in the morning, even being out here at twilight here, the air actually smelled like Welch's grapes. And if you were to actually pick the grapes right off of the vine, they tasted identical to the juice you would be drinking. It's a very fertile place, especially up in northern Michigan. If you look, or central Michigan, I should say, it's known as the fruit belt. And in the fruit belt, you can actually they grow, I think, second to California, the most diverse amount of fruit comes out of this part of the country. Agriculture is a gigantic part of the Great Lakes Basin, but it hasn't come without a massive cost. This is Lake Erie. Every year, Lake Erie blooms into this gigantic algae bloom. And why this is happening is because there's a lot of excess phosphates and nitrates that have entered into the waters. And around, late July, early August, when the temperatures are hot enough, it ignites these phosphates and nitrates into these massive algae blooms, which smother out the entire marine system underneath. And it's doing tremendous damage. It deoxygenates the water. And there's no solution to how you can fix these algae blooms because there just simply hasn't been one that's been figured out yet. And a lot of this has come in through basically fertilizers and different pesticides and things that are used within the region. This is what it looks like underneath the lakes. This is a small sample of some of the fish. And this is actually the beginning of an algae bloom that's happening right here. You can see that the little tendrils are already starting to photosynthesize in. This is a British petroleum refinery here. And again, this is a place where, they can quickly take petroleum and stick it onto barges. But the problem is the pollutants that have been coming out of these factories has put it really, really impactful into the lakes, putting heavy metals and all sorts of different pollutants into the waters. And over the last 3 years, we've been seeing record-breaking floods that have been taking place in the fringe of the lakes as well. This was right off the coast of Lake Erie. This right here, the waters were actually 3 feet higher than normal. And what's going on is when you get these massive floods, we think about this in terms of human destruction, like buildings that are being destroyed, and it's billions of dollars worth of real estate damage. But truth be told, like as the waters are rising so much from ice melt coming in from the north, excess rain, things like that. But what's happening is when this water gets onto land, it's actually pulling in all sorts of pollutants that are in factories and inside of buildings and things like this, drawing it back into the water where it stays, just like the phosphates and nitrates from all the agriculture runoff and all the pollutants that are coming off of the big factories. And there's no way to pull these heavy metals out of the water. There's no way to pull these different chemicals out. We're pretty much stuck with them. And once you introduce something into a water system, it can just freely circulate around. And with something as big as the Great American Loop, you can access all those oceans on cargo ships, but you can also send pollutants down those rivers just as quickly. And the Great Lakes is a place that's celebrated by so many people. 54 million people live within the region. And these lakes are a treasure to them. People are swimming in these waters, they're recreating them as often as they can. And the crazy thing about this picture here is I shot this about 5 days after an incident had happened down in Gary, Indiana, which is exactly where this is, where a cyanide spill had come off of a steel mill down there. The cyanide had entered the water, and the only way it was discovered was that there were thousands and thousands of fish that were sitting belly up inside of a harbor. And so fishermen saw that and they reported it to the EPA. They went down, they found the traces of cyanide in the water, and they contacted the steel mill that they thought it probably came from. They hadn't even admitted that this had happened. For 5 days, all of these chemicals were sitting in the water, while quite literally millions of people were recreating on the beach very nearby. And so this type of behavior is still happening. And it's just a cherished place all the way from the boundary waters all throughout the region. The Great Lakes Basin is a cherished place, and to be treating it the way we are, we're not only deeply affecting the environment, but we're poisoning the citizens that live around it as well. It's a place for a wild variety of recreation, even ice climbing up in the Upper Peninsula. The problem is with these two stories, when you look at Antarctica and you look at what's going on in the Great Lakes, climate change is exasperating. These are humanity's fingerprints are all over both of these stories here, from what we're doing with krill to what we're doing to the Great Lakes water. And the only way to get past this is really going to be through good leadership. Good leadership from people that we elect, good decision making that happens at that level, because to put all this pressure on people who don't have power, people like me, nothing's ever going to get done. So we need to really lean into better leadership for this. I'm really sorry for the worst presentation I've ever given in my life. I hope you enjoyed the photos. I really don't even know what happened.
So don't worry about that. It was really impressive to see the pictures, to hear your story, even with little glimpses. It kept the audience alive to make up what they envisioned could have been in there. No problem at all. Great presentation. Oop, and I have to be careful here. So I would like to call Susan back to the podium to moderate an amazing panel of people who are thinking deeply about conservation. Alex Deghan, Enric Sala, Haunani Kane, and she will introduce them and they will all appear on screen.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Keith. You know, I really think we owe a great debt of gratitude to our photographers, people who are out there, who are on the scene, who are doing that hard work, capturing these images, because it really is those images that will help all of us understand what's going on in the planet and the beauty and the treasures that we need to protect. So I am very excited to be here with three amazing conservationists today. To moderate a panel about the future of conservation. Now, these three are three global scholars and leaders, and all of them have been rethinking our relationship to the planet. So that's one thing that they have in common. But the other is their resilience and their determination to change the status quo and to start doing things differently. And it is very inspirational. And so let me just jump in, introduce them, and we will get going. So first, Alex Deghan. Hello, Alex. Okay, Alex is the CEO and co-founder of Conservation X Labs, which is an innovation and technology startup focused on ending the sixth mass extinction and reinventing conservation. Alex is also a professor of practice of conservation innovation at ASU and a Global Futures Fellow. Now, Alex's work as a scientist, entrepreneur, government official, and diplomat has taken him all over the world. And he's done everything from create the first national park and park system in Afghanistan to work on conservation and development in Brazil, Madagascar, Russia, and across the United States. And he knows a lot about snow leopards. His book, The Snow Leopard Project, was selected by the journal Nature as one of the top 5 science books of 2019. Now, I know Enric Sala well, and about 20 years ago, when Enric was an associate professor at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, he felt, and I'll quote him, as if he was writing the obituary of the ocean. He had spent his days documenting decline, trying to understand why coral reefs were dying and large predators were disappearing. And he said, I felt like a doctor who was providing a description of how the patient was going to die in excruciating detail, but not providing a solution. So it was unacceptable, and Enric went on to found the Pristine Seas Project and joined National Geographic Society as an explorer in residence. So Enric has headed expeditions from the Franz Josef Land in the Russian Arctic to the waters off New Caledonia in the South Pacific, and just about everywhere in between. He works to establish ocean sanctuaries and marine parks. And in the last 10 years alone, thanks to his efforts and partnerships with governments around the world, an area more than twice the size of India has been protected from all manner of human exploitation. And our final panelist is Haunani Kane, and she is an assistant professor at ASU's School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning, whose work combines geomorphology and paleo-environmental reconstructions with observations and traditional Hawaiian knowledge to better understand how the islands and their residents are affected by climate change. Haunani is a rare combination, a surfer, scientist, and voyager, who is also the first Native Hawaiian woman to receive a doctorate in geology from a Hawaiian university. Science fields, she says, have not yet truly evolved to feel like a comfortable, safe space for Native people. A lot of times we're asked to separate our culture from our science, but when culture and science are grounded, there's so much overlap. And we are going to talk about that overlap and how it figures into the future of conservation. But first, let me just ask that question. This panel is called The Future of Conservation. So, brilliant panelists, What is the future of conservation? Who wants to go first? Can you guys hear me? Are you being responsive? Okay, excellent. Who?
Yeah,
Alex?
I'll kick it off. Absolutely. I think it's a number of different things, particularly in the space that I work in innovation and technology. One is, that there are literally thousands of innovators and entrepreneurs who are transforming the realm as what is possible, that are addressing what I would call the underlying drivers of extinction. I've spent a lifetime building national parks around the world, but until we take the pressures off those parks, we will never be successful. So it is whole new disciplines of science, of technology, of economics that are now involved in conservation that I think are dictating what the future of conservation looks like, which is what Michael Sala originally called both a crisis discipline and a solutions-oriented discipline. I think that's kind of the first thing. I think second is just, the ability to use this incredible democratization of science and technology that has turned us into superheroes, right? It's everything from data science to increases in processing power to sensors from local scale to planetary scale to machine learning that has just given us leverage around what we're trying to do that is out there. And I think it is the recognition that conservation is now the key to achieving every other goal that humans have, from global health to food security. I think these transformations are really in the future of conservation.
Well, it's interesting you would mention that. We just had Peter Seligmann talking about the reciprocal relationship that we have with the earth. And so, Haunani, how important is that as the future of conservation?
Yeah, I think a lot of the work that I do is looking at what are the natural resiliencies, what are the natural thresholds of our systems, understanding what role, say, a coral serves when it comes to not only feeding us physically through the fish that it provides homes for, but also feeding us spiritually, knowing that in certain cultures, like in the native Hawaiian culture, we believe that the first organism created from the darkness was the coral. So through that, we have a genealogical connection to corals, and they also are the foundation of many of our islands, our low-lying islands. So if we begin to think of conservation through that lens, where we're conserving not only biodiversity, not only a particular species, but we're working towards ensuring that future generations can continue to have a relationship with this place, because this place is them, it's their identity. I think that is such a meaningful way to describe the importance of the work that we do.
Thank you. And Enric, I know you talk a lot about one of the things that Peter mentioned, which was 30 by 30. And tell me how that plays out in the future of conservation.
Oh, it is absolutely crucial for the future of not just conservation, the future of Earth, because the science is very clear. Actually, if we want to prevent a planetary crisis, a planetary disaster, that means loss of nature and all the benefits it provides for humanity, climate disaster, but also a health disaster, because, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic originated in wildlife trade. So if you want to prevent this global humanitarian catastrophe, we need half of the planet in its natural state. So 30% of the planet protected by 2030 is the first step. And it seems that so many people believe that protected areas are part of the past, but actually they are a sine qua non to have a future on this planet. And that includes not only creating national parks and marine reserve, but also empowering indigenous people so they can continue to take care of their lands.
Let me just ask another question, which is, so on a regular basis, we get these reports rolling in about how things are worse than ever. We just had the recent report from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which documented that the changes are both happening more quickly and that they're more extreme than before. And yet there seems to be such a numbness to how we react to these. And there certainly is a large gap between the things that governments say they're going to do and the actual action. How can we more effectively communicate the level of urgency that is needed to change things. What about how we tell this story needs to change? To anybody?
I'll start on this one. So you have to tell the story. The problem is that reports and technical data go over people's heads. We have to, if we want people to do things, we need to personalize it. We need to make it human. We need to turn it into human stories. And I think the best, we can be depressive and really want to slit our veins, if we go through the doom and gloom. But what I've seen is that stories of hope, stories of success, where humans are involved, are the most powerful. And one of the stories that I like the most, and I've seen inspiring more people, is telling the story of a local fishing community in Mexico that in the mid-90s in Cabo Pulmo, a little place in Baja California, in the mid-90s, they decided to close part of the area to fishing because they didn't have enough fish to catch. And now this place, after 10 years of protection or more, is one of the most pristine places. It brings so much more money to the community because the tourists want to see this fish. It helps to replenish the areas around. So these are the type of stories. We need more of this type of stories so people see that actually little actions can produce huge benefits.
Alex or Haunani, what do we need to do about our stories, our storytelling around this issue?
Yeah, I'll double down on what Enric says, right? I'm an extinction biologist by training, and I used to tell people that I'm probably the most depressing person you'd ever want to invite for dinner, right? Our job is literally to describe and lament the passing of species professionally, and as Enric would say, write up their obituaries of scientific papers. And conservation is depressing. All the book titles we see are depressing, but it doesn't have to be, right? We can, much as our species have caused these problems, we also have the means to solve them. And I think we need to focus not just on places we need to save or species we need to see, but on the solutions that are available to us, including those that harness indigenous knowledge that allow us to solve these problems. Much as, we can imagine that we just flew a drone on the surface of another planet. If we have the ability to do that, we have totally the ability to solve the problems that we've created here on Earth.
That sounds like an updated version of if we can put a man on the moon, ... right? Yeah. Okay. Haunani, what are you optimistic about when you look at this situation? And obviously there's so many big problems, but what, we're talking about the need for more optimism in our storytelling. What makes you optimistic when you look at the current situation?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to be a part of a worldwide voyage. We sailed around the world on a voyaging canoe over the course of 3 years. And when I think about a lot of the lessons that were learned through that, not only the lessons about how people around the world, many indigenous cultures, are caring for their places and really contributing to the world being a better place. I think just the lessons that we learned on the canoe about having to live sustainably with a limited amount of resources, how we can navigate through oceans, through storms with large gaps in time where you can't see the stars, where it's cloudy, where the wind is pointing in the wrong direction, where you're having just all these obstacles thrown at you. And then to also know that it was only just about 40 years ago where we were able to rediscover this rich history and to prove to the rest of the world that our people are capable of navigating without a GPS, without a sextant. And we're still having publications that are being published in Nature and in Science that are saying that we drifted, that what you guys did didn't happen, but you drifted from South America and from other places. I think the power is truly in the way we tell the story, how we decide to tell the story, how we decide to share that story through both traditional and non-traditional outlets, and the ability that regardless of whatever obstacles are thrown in our way, we're gonna succeed. We have to succeed because this is the only place that we have to call. home, Earth. So regardless of everything that's happening, like we don't have any other choice but to succeed. So that's kind of the way that I tell my long stories to what may seem as simple questions, but we have no other choice but to do this right.
So one of the things we've been talking about today is the ability of individuals to take action, but also the need for much more broad and sweeping action by governments, by businesses, et cetera. And I think what one of you said to me in a previous conversation last week was, we need top-down regulation. Just asking people to do the right thing is insufficient. And there was a lot of agreement about that. So Alex, tell me more about that.
Yeah, so when under President Trump, we pulled out of the Paris agreements, Conservation X Labs, working with the Indian government and the Rocky Mountain Institute, decided to launch something called the Global Cooling Prize, which was to reinvent the air conditioner, the room AC. Cooling technology, according to the original version of Project Drawdown, was the #1 thing we could do for climate change. And we wanted a solution that didn't have to depend on governments at that time. And the result of that, this challenge was for a 5-fold increase in cooling efficiency. We got to 10-fold, right? That including, testing. It was a $3 million prize that involved 3 months of actually testing these prototypes that they had built. And we got to this level. That is the equivalent of taking off Australia and Finland off the emissions map for those contributions. So one is this incredible power of human ingenuity around the world. And one of the things we believe is talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. And we need to crank up opportunity for people to be involved in conservation from all over the world, especially those closest to the problems. But we have first the ability to be able to actually address some of these problems. Second is we are seeing changes in companies and changes because they're realizing that their bottom line depends on being sustainable. They're realizing that they can't recruit the best people unless they change what they're doing, unless they change their supply chains, unless they, close the loop on their systems. And then finally is, it seems like entire countries and the populace behind them want to see things like 30 by 30 come about. So I'm hopeful because of those changes.
Enric, you work with government officials all the time and get them to agree to do these amazing things. How do you do that? And is there a lesson in that for other parts of the world that these things are possible?
Yeah, well, we're dealing with humans, right? It doesn't matter if they are country presidents or company CEOs or coastal fishermen. And we always ask, okay, what's in it for them? Right. So when we go to a place and we identify the problems and what are the needs of the local population, we always map. We do a power map. Who's going to oppose any conservation because they make their profits by destroying nature? Who's going to support it, etc. And at the end of the day, it's just find the right incentives and the right motivations for every group. And when it comes to political leaders, there are moments that are best for getting action, and that tends to be at the end of their term when they are thinking about their legacy. Then, if they leave and they are not going to be reelected, then it's much easier to be able to push for ambition, thinking of that legacy.
Haunani, I want to get back to one of the things that you talk a lot about, which is the intersection of traditional indigenous knowledge and sort of Western science. And often those areas of expertise have seemed like two different camps, right? And there didn't seem to be any overlap. But yet you talk about there is great overlap and the need for that. Can you elaborate on that a little bit and how we can kind of get that message out there?
Yeah, sure. So as I continue to get older and and continue to do more work, I really am seeing that what we view through a traditional lens and what we view through our scientific lens, like in many ways, they are the same. In many ways, we are at the core, we're observing, we're trying to interpret, we're trying to understand the world around us, and we might just be using different tools. A lot of the work that I do in terms of conservation, and when I think about conservation, is I always try to imagine how will restrictions or how will things that we do in a space in order to make them better also ensure that the people that are from that place, that feed themselves from that place, that rely upon that place and their families rely upon that place, how do we ensure that they continue to maintain a relationship with that place? Like Enric said, you think about it in terms of what are the costs and benefits to all the parties that are involved. And a lot of times in conservation, you need to think about the people of that place as well. If the closure of that place will keep people out, or if it will allow people to continue to access that place and through their relationships with that place, continue to help to make that place a better place. So it's been through those lenses, through those mindsets, through understanding the values of the people from various places that I've really seen that traditional knowledge, Western science, at the very core, it's just a means of understanding and developing relationships with people in place.
Enric, what are some things that we should just stop doing? I mean, things that make people feel good about conservation that we ought to just stop doing to focus on other more important things? And what are those other more important things?
Things that we should stop doing, you mean in terms of activities that destroy nature? Or yeah, well, let me just mention one, bottom trawling, which is this practice that plows the seafloor, the bottom of the ocean with huge and heavy nets that are the biggest bottom trawlers in the world are 360 feet long. Their nets are so large that you can fit 12 747 jets within. And not only they destroy the bottom of the ocean to catch fish or shrimp, in many places, the bycatch is huge. That bycatch means that, for example, my friend, Minister White in Gabon just told me that they went on board a bottom trawler and they got the catch, and only 1% of the catch, 1% of the catch was shrimp, which was the target species. Everything else was sea stars and fish and ray that then they discarded overboard. Not only that, but also we have estimated that bottom trawling, by disturbing the carbon that is on the seafloor, which is the largest carbon storehouse on the entire planet, and that carbon, when it is resuspended in the water, and it's available to microbes, produces carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide, the CO2 emissions caused by bottom trawling are larger than Germany's. They are larger than the emissions of global aviation. So there you go. There is one thing we can do, stop bottom trawling, and that would solve many of the major issues we're dealing with.
Okay, Alex, what is the thing that we need to stop doing?
There's so many different things. Just one that you're going to make me focus, and it's a good thing. Obviously eating meat is a huge one, and just thinking about the impact that has on the planet. There is so many amazing alternatives that are coming up now that are incredible, right? Both from cellular agriculture and plant-based agriculture, including a company called New Wave Foods that was started by a Scripps oceanographer, marine scientist, and a Carnegie Mellon material scientist that makes shrimp out of red algae. That's now, it's no longer shellfish, so it's now vegan and kosher. It doesn't have the incredible rates of bycatch that we just heard about. It doesn't have the slavery issues. It doesn't have mangrove deforestation and pollution that aquaculture has within it. It's even carbon negative because of the use of of carbon. So there are all these alternatives that are coming up that allow us to help get off this diet of red meat that isn't even very good for us or the planet to begin with.
Okay, Haunani, what is the one thing we should stop doing?
I'm gonna switch it up a little bit, and I'm gonna comment on one thing that we should be doing. And I think one thing we should be doing is getting to know our food, getting to know where our food comes from, getting to know how our food is grown, and getting to know our local farmer, our local fisherman, our local hunter, and supporting our local agriculture and food industry.
Actually, these answers are interesting because they're all related to food, right? So no more bottom trawling, no more eating meat, and get to understand where your food comes from. I do think that is pretty interesting observation from these three experts. And so let me just a couple more questions. What does a world in harmony mean to you, all of you? I know you study this for, as your vocation, but also your avocation and your passion. So what does that mean? We hear a lot of people talking about a world in harmony. Enric, what does that mean in your view?
Well, from the most selfish perspective, is a world where nature provides enough for humanity, right? Which means that there is enough nature out there so we can continue cleaning our water and absorbing our pollution and giving us food. But we don't have enough intact nature to be able to save us from a climate catastrophe, for example. This is why we need to get to half of the planet in its natural state. So half of the planet for the rest of nature and half of the planet for us used responsibly. That's harmony for me.
Alex, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I brought this book, which I've had since I was 9 years old, and you'd be happy to know it's a National Geographic book. And it told me about the passenger pigeon, which I read about when I was 9, and just imagining that we took this species that darkened the sky for 3 days when it had passed overhead down to zero. Our species did that, was horrifying to 9-year-old me. And I dedicated my life to extinction from that point on. So a world in harmony means a world without human-induced extinction.
Haunani, how would you answer that?
Well, I think that's a tough question. For me, when I think about, and I'm sorry, my iMessage is attached to my computer, but when I think about a world in harmony, I think about us as humans still being challenged to be better versions of ourselves, still being challenged to help to make the world a better place. And I think about the future generations as well. And I think about the world that we would want our children to live in, a world where they're not judged based upon the color of their skin. They're not judged based upon their religious beliefs, and they're not pressured to be things that they don't feel comfortable with. But I think a big portion of that, as well as envisioning the future, is envisioning the physical state of the world that we want to live in as well, and continuing, like we're all doing, just continuing our best to ensure that the impact that we have on this world only ensures that it'll be a better version than what it is now.
Let me end with something that Peter Seligmann mentioned at the end of his wonderful talk. He talked about the role of young people and the power that young people have. He talked about the voices, of young people demanding change. Do you see this in your work? And do you really think that this next generation is different from our generation? Maybe I shouldn't put myself in your group, but okay, your generation. Are things really changing, do you think, with this group of, young people coming up? Enric?
Absolutely, yes. Not only now, of course, it's not partly is because of the access to information and the access to reach every single human on the planet very easily with our technology. But thanks to that, partly, the younger generation is more aware. They don't have they don't have the baggage, they don't have the financial interest that many older people have in continue to destroy the planet. So that helps. One could say, well, yeah, all these kids protesting and on social media all the time, but that doesn't really impact policy. Well, I would say that these kids are going to be, some of them are going to be leaders soon. And I have seen it in my own experience with the younger heads of state. They are so much more responsive. They are not beholden to the big old corporations. And they are the ones who are being more ambitious. They are the ones who are pushing the 30 by 30 agenda, for example, the climate agenda. And they are the ones who, before leaving office, they want to get things done. They want to leave that legacy. So we are already seeing the people who were there 15 years ago, they are now in positions of leadership. And the change, I think, is dramatic, which is great news.
Yeah, Alex, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm pushed all the time by my team, by my students to think different, to think differently about what we're doing. And just think about what we're going through together as humanity and what has happened to these current younger generations that are coming on in terms of the pandemic, right? We heard Jane Goodall say, this pandemic was created by the misuse of nature. It was not our first pandemic that was done so. It will not be our last, right? And it is deforestation that increases virus shedding. It is climate change and invasive species that are spreading new pathogens to new places. It's the wildlife trade, the pet trade, the bushmeat. They're not going to be allowing us to pursue. And it's not just that, right? It is microplastics that serve as platforms for disease and toxins. It is our demand for electronics that's deforesting the Congo Basin, the Amazon with the largest amount of mercury in the emissions in the world. They're going to demand something different. They're going to demand circularity. They're looking for alternatives to fast fashion. They're going to demand food that is friendlier for the planet. They're going to demand the transformation of our basic economy. And the companies and institutions that don't follow that will be disrupted. And that's what we can hope for.
Haunani, I know you work with a lot of younger people in your work. Do you see that they're different?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of what's really exciting about this up and coming generation, especially when we think about sustainability and we think about the health of our planet, is just seeing the diversity of interest across not only those that are interested in science, but those that are interested in being actors, are interested in music, just to see how quickly and how open and accepting the next generation is of trying to make this world a better place. As well as even with this younger generation, when we look at how much more in touch they are with their culture and how they can speak their native tongue, and they can also understand the most complex forms of Western science as well. And I think really being able to be open and inclusive of all those viewpoints, as we have seen in a lot of the younger generation, is really going to help us to progress forward as humanity.
Well, I think we will end it there. I wish I could talk to the three of you all night long. But Alex, Haunani, and Enric, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. And I will turn it over one last time to Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That brings us to the end of this session. Wonderful session. A lot of insights, different dimensions, different viewpoints into the future of conservation. Wonderful imagery. Keith, it reminded me of being on an icebreaker falling 30 meters down from waves into the water. water breaking over the bridge. So very, very inspiring. Also the Great Lakes pictures. So let's thank all of our speakers and contributors again. And before closing, I just wanted to make sure that you are aware that in this auditorium, 2 hours from now at 6 o'clock, there will be a session of the Democracy and Climate Change event, which is held here in parallel to our Earth Week events, and in essence is integrated into it, that will be featuring former Vice President Al Gore. So that will be followed by reception outside in the atrium. You probably saw in the background here, there is already the setup activity going on. So that's open to everybody. So if you are interested in that, please come back at 6 o'clock. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day. Thank you.